This series is about a legend of the Paris Dakar rallies of the 1980s, the BMW R80 GS. My name is Altus Pinaar, and you are welcome to join me for a deep dive into the mechanics of one of these special models. And as a bonus, I've actually got hold of one of the last frames that was produced by HPN, and we are going to be assembling this bike right here in my backyard in South Africa. I will be discussing how the rally bikes differed from the very popular R80 GS Adventure Tourer launched by BMW in 1980. I will also tell you about HPN, the company who originally designed and built these rally bikes for the BMW Motorrad factory, piloted by riders like Hubert Oriol, Gaston Rahir and Eddie Howe. The model which I will be assembling over the next few weeks is a bit of a Frankenstein. HPN calls this model the HPN Sport, and it's fitted with a more modern R1100 GS swing arm. Okay, so, we've had quite a great discussion about the merits of choosing a nice clean bike for a donor bike. Behind me here is this beautiful R100. It was manufactured in the third month of 1993. And the bike has got less than 10,000 kilometers on the clock, and it has been meticulously taken care of, maintained and serviced, and it was kept indoors. It clearly didn't stand outside in the sun and weather. So it's in perfectly serviceable condition, no repairs needed, nothing to do, fresh battery, you start it and off it goes. Using a bike like this for a donor bike versus buying an old shoddy road model out of the early 80s, if you consider the price of new parts these days, and on top of that the time to completely clean up and renovate all these parts and replace all the worn parts, you'd find that you would save a lot of money by just rather investing in a nice clean airhead model instead of going for a cheap, well-used older airhead. So my recommendation is always go for the cleanest bike that you can get a hold of. And yes, you could say you're going to do this as a project, you're going to have fun, and of course your time you're going to invest in it, and it's not going to cost you extra money. But even so, it's fine, do that, strip everything, put it all back together, clean it up and refurbish and so on if you want to. But if you have to buy a new set of pistons and rings and perhaps a sleeve because the sleeves is worn out, you're looking at a serious amount of money. Just for those couple of components, you could pay as much as buying a whole entire bike, a shoddy bike, of course. And that's just, a couple of parts, So generally when the pistons and rings and the sleeves is worn to that point that they need replacement, I can guarantee you that just about everything that goes into the carbs is going to need replacement. The gearbox will have to need a complete overhaul. And then these are just replacing parts that are worn. Now, on top of that, if you did buy an older model, then there's a couple of things that you might want to upgrade to some of the newer parts which were, just made the bike a lot more refined. So this was the most refined airhead model that BMW produced. And there's a massive difference between this R100R versus RS or RT out of the early 80s, for instance. And it goes through from the cylinder head, different valves, guides, the seat angle was cut differently, the rocker gear were different, definitely a lot more robust than the early ones, quieter than the early ones. You go to the gearbox, the input shaft together with coupler knuckle, that spring-loaded knuckle that sort of helps absorb the shock if you pop the clutch a bit hard. All of that was changed and updated. You know, the X-type gears, which was less prone to pitting, cam on which the selector mechanism operates, which, you know, prevented false neutrals. There was different parts fitted to the carburetors, which made it easier and safer to set. Jetting was slightly changed as well. There's a whole long list of improvements that was made and refinements that was made. Now, usually most of these things you could retrofit all those newer parts to the older bikes. But if you start adding those things up, you're talking about thousands in expenses to do that. And that's why it really makes sense to try and go for a model that's as new as possible and as well maintained and looked after as possible as a donor bike. And in this case, for instance, we've got a frame from a different bike. It was from a GS. So we're in actual fact not even going to use this frame, although this frame can be also converted into either an HPN Sport version or any of the other models that HPN has on their list. So if you're going to look for a donor where you want to modify the frame as well, then of course going for a GS frame or GS style frame, there was a couple of road models like this R100R. They all had frames which was based on the GS frame, and so the important part is that the foot pegs could swivel. So you could easily, even though this one comes with a rubber foot peg, you could easily remove that and fit off-road style foot peg. The geometry of all the airhead frames was exactly the same as on the GS model. It was only subtle, small differences, but differences that are really a pain in the butt to try and to rectify. The foot peg mounting position, for instance, to be able to make a road frame that had the sort of fixed foot pegs, to modify that so that you can have fit a swivel peg on there. It's just an absolute nightmare. It's not an easy fix. And so the recommendation is for an off-road bike, rather just look for a GS or GS style frame as your donor. You know, saying that, I really would think very careful before you take a nice original bike. And even if it's a little bit sort of worn and tatty, if it's still original and everything is still complete, really consider if you want to actually take a frame and modify it. Some of the older GS models are reaching a bit of a collector status at this point, and people are paying a really good amount of money for these bikes. So you will reduce its value if you start modifying and changing things, especially things that you change permanently, like the frame. If you start welding on the frame, you know, you can't go back on that. So really, before you take a bike, pull it apart to try and modify it, consider its value as it is, as an original G/S or even just a R80 or R100 GS. It was a different story when you took the bike, you send the frame over to HPN and they modified it for you. Because the HPN in itself is going to be a very scarce bike, and if their stamp is on that frame, it will also increase in value. And on top of that, the value of what you're getting from a frame that was modified by them, it's an absolute amazing motorcycle, and that is why we're doing what we're doing here. Nobody else can even come close to competing with HPN in regards to the frame changes that was made. They had a massive jig into which they would mount these frames after they've been welded. They would then de-stress and straighten that frame to a specific level, and nobody else that I know of actually can even copy or try and do the same thing. And you know, in terms of how the frame will handle, it's debatable on what the difference would be and how safe would it be. HPN had a very high standard. Initially, they were built for BMW for the Dakar rallies, and so of course there was quite a bit of money that was behind them when they started to develop these special modified frames. And so there is ultimately always going to be a difference in value in terms of an HPN frame or just some backyard hack made a couple of gussets and welded it in place. They're copying what they see on pictures. They don't even understand why a particular gussets was placed in a particular position. Before you leave, the next episode will follow soon and will cover the unboxing of many of the special parts supplied by HPN, as well as a close-up look at the frame, showing you exactly how the frame is modified and reinforced. So I can recommend that you subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell to ensure that you won't miss out on the rest of this series.